Matt, thanks for taking the time to come on the podcast today. I'm sure a lot of the listeners are really going to appreciate some of the information you have to provide and what it is you're involved in. But just to kick things off, do you mind just briefly introducing yourself and what it is you're doing on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the invitation, Adam. Excited to speak with you today. So I am involved mostly with teaching and writing as a professor of philosophy and religion at a school in San Francisco called the California Institute of Integral Studies, which kind of emerged out of the San Francisco Renaissance. And we teach philosophy in my department in a way trying to kind of resurrect the ancient sense of philosophy as a way of life, as a spiritual practice, and not just as something merely academic. And so for me, engaging with students and with the academy, with academic philosophy, I kind of have a foot in two worlds. On the one hand, trying to engage with the academic discourse, but on the other hand, having a foot in the other world of taking spirituality seriously, taking human experience in its full depth seriously as a source of insight and knowledge and even wisdom, which is not often, though it's beginning to shift a bit, but still not often taken seriously, or there's not much room made for that in philosophy departments at most universities. So we're kind of straddling the edge of academia in my department, and so a lot of my work is trying to shift that discourse. In particular, though, maybe your listeners are familiar with some of the philosophers that I think with. Alfred North Whitehead, a process philosopher, is one of them. He has a very organic, evolutionary understanding of the universe and the human role within that universe. And also some of the German idealist and romantic philosophers like Friedrich Schelling and Hegel and the poet Novalis and so on. So those are some of the names, just to drop them in there in case people are familiar, that I think with, so you can orient me in this philosophical lineage.
And I guess it's interesting. Do you find that philosophy is something that is helping bridge the gap in terms of spirituality when it comes to academia and universities? Like, is that sort of the doorway into it from your experience?
It certainly can be. Um, there's also religious studies, and I'm in a philosophy and religion department. And so in that context, there is more room to discuss spirituality and an experientially grounded approach to the wisdom traditions and religion more generally, mysticism, esotericism, and so on. And so there's more opportunity to discuss these things and to not just get blank stares in, the disciplines within which I work, not only philosophy, but religious studies as well. So yeah, there's definitely a doorway.
Yeah, that's pretty neat. I mean, I just know that other fields of study are just so completely so far removed from that type of stuff that yeah, you would get those blank stares if I went to school for like business and marketing and things like that. So it was just like stuff like that was nothing, nowhere near anything that we covered or discussed. But I've always had this growing interest in it. So thinking back, it's like I feel like I would have had more fun doing something like philosophy or even did you sort of get into theology as well when it comes to the religious studies?
Oh yeah, definitely. Both, studying the history of theology, but also exploring what's called process theology. It's kind of one of my home bases, which is a unique approach to understanding the nature of the divine as something that we human beings participate in, that is, responsive to the way in which we engage with it. So it's not this more traditional image of a distant creator deity that's just completely transcendent and has no relationship to human life. So yeah, theology is definitely part
Hmm.
of what I do.
So do you think even at like on the on a micro scale that there is this sort of overarching divinity or creativity or God energy? Like, is that sort of a way you would consider it, that even for each individual, and it's again in a lot of old religious traditions, they see this outside of themselves, and they see this as something that they, even pray to. So do you think that this is something that's more intertwined and interconnected with every individual on a day-to-day basis? Is that your thought?
I do, but I also think there's an important tension to hold, because the danger of identifying with the divine too quickly and too easily is that we mistake our own ego for the divine, and become engaged in a kind of spiritual narcissism. And so there's a wisdom in acknowledging the transcendence of the divine, but when that is upheld in opposition to, or in a exclusive way, without any recognition of the immanence of the divine within, in other words, the divine that is, as St. Augustine said, closer to ourselves than we are to ourselves. The divine that's discovered in relationship with others as the very bond that allows us to connect with each other. That sense of an immanent divine is essential, and often ignored by some of the religious traditions, because they're so afraid of that sort of mystical identification with the Godhead, that they totally cut off any possibility of that. But I do think it's important to hold that tension, and not simply identify God with the self, right? Because I think that can be just as dangerous as a fully transcendent image of the divine. So, yeah, I try to hold that tension.
Yeah, it can be a little bit of a trap as well. I can see why. So do you find that religion in itself, or as a whole, like, and the different religions that are out there, sort of convolute things a little bit or muddy the water when it comes to having a deeper understanding of these things? Like, do you find that it just creates a lot of noise?
Well, I mean, contemporary life, in the midst of the various forms of noisy technology and social media and all these things, are very distracting on their own. We have such a information overload, not just with regard to understanding the present state of the world. Like, we're just inundated by the various emergencies all around the planet all the time, but we're also, I think, overwhelmed by just the capacity to Google anything about history, Google any religion, and read the Wikipedia page on whatever religion, and think that gives us some understanding of this multi-millennial lineage of thought. So no, I don't think of the religious traditions as noise. I think of them as deep wells that we can drink from. But in order to, penetrate through the sort of waves on the surface that can be distracting, I think it requires sustained study, and not just reading a Wikipedia page, but potentially finding an elder in that tradition, and learning from them, or doing a lot of reading, or both. But I think where our contemporary culture, particularly younger people who have grown up with social media, I think we're in real need of looking again at these traditions to inherit the wisdom that was built up over thousands of years. I don't think it's just noise, though. Plenty of contemporary religious believers who themselves haven't really looked at the depth of their own tradition, but just parrot what their preacher or pastor says, and whatnot. That can be noise, but I think there's a depth below the surface that we can penetrate to.
But it takes such effort, it seems, for the everyday individual, as you said. I mean, it's just a quick 2-minute Wikipedia search, and they think they've got it all figured out. And it's funny you mentioned Wikipedia because it's not the greatest source of information. But what's the approach do you feel, and especially yourself as an educator, how do you feel the best way to get to someone, the younger generations, the ones that have the 15 to 30 second attention span, the TikTokers of the world? How to get through to those individuals to really even just spark an interest initially, so they start to get more of that longing for a deeper understanding of these things.
Well, you have to slow down enough to catch yourself regurgitating cliches or slogans or engaging with the culture, with society, with your peers in a way that remains at the level of sloganeering, where you're trying to remain part of an in group instead of really discovering the truth. And so, the first thing I would recommend is just to pause and, maybe put your phone down, close your laptop, and reconnect with the sheer fact that you exist. And, maybe think about that for more than 10 or 15 seconds and just sit with it. And it can be kind of scary if you never take the time to unplug for a second, because it can almost seem like there's nothing there. You start to lose the habitual track that your mind is on, but there's an opening if you stay with that, to the sheer fact of your existence. And I think, philosophy, as Aristotle said, begins in wonder. And I think sitting with, again, just the sheer fact that you exist without trying to describe it or explain it, just being with beingness, can produce this sense of wonder, right? Like, why is there something rather than nothing, right? Very simple, basic, and profound question. And just sitting with it, I think, can shatter our habitual conceptions of who we are and what we're supposed to be doing here. And it's, a practice you can cultivate that continues to deepen. It might be boring initially because you feel like, oh, I'm missing some notifications on my Instagram or something. But that is all, I think, a distraction from the mystery that awaits us when we turn inward and contemplate our own existence. So seems simple enough. I know it's easier said than done, and it can produce feelings of anxiety and fear when you do that, because you do start to lose, you step off the conveyor belt of, the chattering in your mind and the habitual patterns that guide you through life. And that can initially feel, like you're hovering over an abyss and you don't know where it leads. But I think if you stick with it, that opens up into, and it opens up in a way that can totally reorient you in life.
Hmm. Yeah, I was about to say some people would feel downright fearful when doing that, even just setting phone away and turning off all that information. Some people, I could imagine, and I've met people over the years that just would not be capable of doing that. I wonder what it is that drives that fear and that anxiety. Is it this just constant flow of information and these signals around us all the time? Like, what do you feel is it almost feels like a weight, or like some sort of heaviness at times. And I say that because I'm in sort of technological industry myself. Um, and it's wild how quick things move, and how hard it is in some ways to do what you just described, to sort of step away from it and then just kind of be with being. And then when you step back into it, it's almost like I reemerge myself into it. And it's so wild, like it's chaotic. So what do you think is causing that sort of? Is it just the amount of information and how it just keeps compounding as time goes on, like you get more and more and more?
Well, I think to a large extent we have created a digital environment that is designed to reflect and amplify me, right? And so we create our profiles and we choose our news sources and who we follow, and it all reflects me. And that construct of the me, the ego, is really no more than an image. It's a mirage, you could even say. And the digital environments that we live in nowadays are, again, amplifying and empowering this mirage. And eventually, we're gonna grow older, we're gonna get sick. Maybe people around us who we love will die, and one day we're gonna die. And I think when we're trapped in this hall of mirrors that's just reflecting me all the time, we never get the opportunity to consider our own mortality. Philosophy, as Socrates said, is learning to die. And so, what's the source of the anxiety that we feel, I think, is this deeper recognition, maybe just below the level of consciousness, that this identity that we cling to is not real, that it's ephemeral, that it's fragile, and that ultimately we all know one day we're going to die, and we're terrified of that because, well, it's mysterious, it's unknown, and it challenges that small sense of identity that we're continually amplifying, with social media, with so much of the consumer culture that surrounds us. And so, ultimately it's death anxiety, I think, that would be at the base of that sense of heaviness that you're describing. But the good news is, again, I think when you turn inward and develop a kind of contemplative attitude and disposition toward life, that anxiety subsides and opens up into different emotions, maybe even love, gratitude, wonder, as I mentioned. And so, while it can initially seem terrifying to not continually amplify that sense of like me, and the narcissism that's rampant in our culture, I think if we give that spaciousness and emptiness and wonder a chance, it's actually, there's nothing to be afraid of. And similarly with death, it's a mystery. It's nobody knows what happens when we die, right? But as a mystery, like, the only reason we would fear it is because we're attached to this illusory sense of ego identity. And when we let go of that, there's really no reason to be afraid. It becomes more, not necessarily exciting. I'm not suggesting people should be excited to die, but I think it's something you can relate to more as an adventure, as paradoxically, it's your birthright that you get to experience that passing through that threshold. It's something every human being has to do. There's no escape from it, despite what some transhumanists are hoping. And so, better to embrace it while you're still in good health and young enough to really cultivate that sense of wonder and contemplative depth. But yeah, to answer your question, I think it's the anxiety that we experience in the face of death.
Mm. And do you feel that this sort of illusory experience, let's call it, do you feel that that's sort of predominantly placed as the primary from birth for an individual? I mean, that's sort of my thought on it. We were not really taught about anything outside of that, in the education system for the most part, unless you're going into something like philosophy or theology or religious studies. But for the most part, it seems like everything else just ignores most of what you're describing, and it seems like everyone's driven towards this, this false idea of what reality truly is. And so I guess the question is, do you feel that that's something that happens at an early age? And if so, why do you think that is? And a priority is placed on that versus sort of a deeper inner experience, let's say, of the world instead of an outward experience.
Yeah, I mean, to speak in really general terms about major shifts in history, and to just focus on the modern West, I think in the medieval period, maybe there was too much emphasis on what comes after this life, and then as modernity really got up and running, there was a total reversal, and now we're at the point where there's an overemphasis on just this life, on the secular rather than the sacred and the transcendent. And so, ultimately we need a balance here, but I think in our contemporary culture, the default worldview is, pretty much that your consciousness is an excretion of your brain, and that when you die, you just disappear, and you're gone forever. So best to acquire and accumulate and enjoy the material aspects of life while you're still alive. And so you get this worship of youth and certain conceptions of beauty and of money and acquisition, none of which matters when you're on your deathbed. And so I think that sense of false identity is just this default worldview, and the psychology that goes along with it that comes from, again, moving to this opposite extreme of, what, say, the medieval period that tended to do, which was focus on just the afterlife. And so I would say we need a more integral worldview that would balance these approaches, and value this life and the body, and try to make the earth a better place. And it's not that we need to reject technology and modern conveniences, or science and whatnot, but we also need to put it into a deeper context, and recognize that the human endeavor is a multi-generational project, and it's not just about me. And even if death is the end for everything I identify with in this life, the species continues, and we're all a part of that. And so we do have some greater sense of identity beyond just the 75 odd years that we get to be in this particular body.
Hmm. Yeah, and you work with a lot of younger students and whatnot. Do you find that they are inquisitive to this stuff, or is it, I mean, obviously if they're in that field of study, they would be, but are you noticing a rise in the number of youth sort of interested in this?
Well, I should say I don't teach too many undergraduates.
Okay.
A lot of my students are actually older than I am.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so what I actually notice is older people who are mid or late career, often in the tech world, because, I'm in San Francisco here,
Mm-hmm.
who, they've made enough money, they're financially secure, but they're not fulfilled in their profession. And when they were younger, they had some interest or passion in philosophy or spirituality or religion, and they want to come back to graduate school to rediscover and engage with those interests, and so they leave their career, and they come back to school. So I actually see more older people, who have already kind of succeeded in their professional lives, who now want to do some personal work and some transpersonal work, some spiritual cultivation and whatnot. So I can't speak as much, at least in my own personal experience, to what younger people are doing.
But what you're saying about the older generation is already, I mean, that's pretty interesting in itself. It's a lot of people are moving about their lives, and they reach a certain point and say, you know what, I've come this far, but what have I really accomplished? Like what have I really learned along the way? So it's interesting that you say that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't work much with youth at all, or you don't?
So I mean, once in a while I do some guest teaching for high school students in the Bay Area here, in Sacramento, a couple hours from here. And I can say that for 17, 18-year olds, the philosophical dialogue is way more direct. The questions tend to be more simple, but profound because of their simplicity, whereas in graduate school, we're like reading Heidegger or Whitehead or something, and we're so conceptual and trying to refine our understanding of these obscure points. That can be fun and interesting, don't get me wrong, but before you've read any philosophy and you're just again like rooted in that basic sense of curiosity and wonder about the nature of existence, the questions that arise from that baseline, I think, are the truly philosophical ones. And so, in some sense, it's refreshing to be in dialogue with teenagers about philosophy who aren't schooled and weighed down by having studied this, 2000 plus 2500 year history of philosophy. So it's important to, remember that you don't need to be highly educated in the sense that you've studied all of these difficult books in order to philosophize. In some ways, you're actually closer to the source before you've read all the books.
Yeah, that's like there's a lot of sayings where you're supposed to learn a lot and then just forget everything because
Mm-hmm.
after a certain point, it doesn't really serve you. You start to actually develop these like dogmas or these like conditional thinking patterns around that one thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I feel like I've gotten that way sometimes when I listen to a lot of audiobooks. I'll go through like this just spree of just back to back to back for months, and then I just stop listening to everything, and I'll just listen to like music or something for a little bit to take a break because it just gets a little bit overwhelming at times. It's like sometimes just it's even hard to retain a lot of that. I mean, you'd mentioned what 2,500 years. It's like I mean, that's wild. That's like a lot to take in. Do you find yourself how long have you been in the field?
I mean, I've been teaching since 2016, but studying philosophy as a student since high school, really. So since I was about 16, I think I got the itch. 36 now, so that's 20 years.
Okay. And do you find you're still like acquiring information, learning new things at this time, at 20 years
Oh,
in?
there's always more information to acquire, and more knowledge, more names and dates and ideas to learn. But my basic drive and the sort of insight that got me interested in philosophy from the very beginning is still there, and I often need to remind myself to contact it because, as you were saying, it can kind of get covered over
Hmm.
by all the information and the history and whatnot. Not,
It's
not
that
that.
sense of wonder actually that you mentioned earlier, right? It sort of ties in right with that. It's like, do you still have that and do you have to work for it kind of thing?
The work is putting to the side the professional desire and need to be an expert in whatever specific subdiscipline of philosophy, and to reconnect with that wonder. The wonder itself is is pretty easy. It's a childlike state of sort of innocent, playful being, without being concerned about a colleague destroying my argument, in a paper or whatever. It's just the joy of existence and the yeah, that feeling of wonder and being okay with not knowing. I mean, in some sense, the more educated I became, moving through undergrad and and graduate school and getting my PhD, the more I knew I didn't know, right? And so philosopher Nicholas of Cusa talked about learned ignorance. And I think the truly humble philosophers, at least, would admit this, that, the more you learn about the tradition and trying to study it from the inside out, not just as a collection of names and dates and ideas and so on, but to live into the worldviews that are being articulated, to inhabit them from the inside out, you come to discover that that the truth is multifaceted and probably infinite, and we can get these different perspectives on it, but that ultimately, the more we come to know, the more ignorant we realize we are, right? And so part of getting a PhD in philosophy, I think, as I often tell my students, it's not that you come to know everything, it's that you become, you cultivate a kind of humility, and you at least know where you might want to look to learn the things you don't know. You kind of get a lay of the land and know which parts of that map are totally blank, but at least, again, with the amount of information at our fingertips nowadays, we need to cultivate more the skill for filtering it, navigating the information superhighway, rather than attempting to digest all of it at
Hmm.
once.
It almost sounds like you're saying it kind of gives a framework to other things, or at least like allows sort of a base to build from in terms of learning new things.
Mm-hmm.
Would that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah, no, it's just really interesting. I mean, I love it myself, and it's funny because you mentioned these sort of tech people that go to school. It's like something that I feel like I would do. It's just like I've been in tech for 20 something years, and it's like I'm just tired at a certain point of being in it. What I do now actually is I do sensory deprivation. So every like once a week, I go into float tanks for like an hour, sometimes an hour and a half. And that has been my good way to completely detach from all of it. Because if I didn't do stuff like that, then, or even just going for walks in nature really helps. Um, but without that, I think I would just lose my mind. Like it's just totally crazy. And I could see why people would want to go back to school to sort of get that foundation, to get that initial base, and then maybe they could reapproach their lives and what they've been doing, from a new perspective. Um,
Mm.
so are you still like enthused with your day to day of the whole thing? Like you mentioned, sort of you have to deal with sometimes like people will review your paper and things like that. Like do these things sort of bog you down, or how do you manage that and navigate that?
It can be stressful to be an academic in a context where your job sort of depends on publishing continually, and it's a kind of perverse the system is set up with these perverse incentives, because it's hard to think deeply with deadlines, and with the requirement that what to seek promotion or whatever, you have to have this many articles published. It's like just publishing an article just for the sake of a line on your CV or something is not what philosophy is supposed to be about. I mean, if you have something to say, you should articulate it. If you don't have anything to say, you have no business pretending to contribute to the storehouse of philosophical inquiry. So that can be challenging. But again, I'm lucky to teach at a school that is sort of staffed by, to some extent, academic refugees. So the faculty purposefully sought out a school like CIIS because they were not happy with the way that academia as a profession operates for the most part. And so, I am afforded a bit more freedom to teach what I want and to research and write about what I'm passionate about. So in that sense, I'm in a unique position among academic philosophers. But it's the students that come into the program who carry such tremendous enthusiasm that really helps support me in the sense that it's contagious. And if I do ever forget why I'm doing this, it doesn't take very long for the students to ask those questions or share their experience or offer some reflection about how grateful they are that a program like this exists. That it just helps remind me and re-energize me. And it's such a privilege to be able to make a living engaging in this realm of ideas, exploring this realm of ideas with people. And so I try not to ever forget that, even when I have three dissertations to review and revise. It's important to remind myself what a privilege it is, to do that for a living.
Yeah, it's great that you have those people there to help remind you too, like, your students. That's it's like if you're losing that spark, they'll help rekindle it right away, I'm sure, especially because you sort of experience that wonder and that enthusiasm through them. It sounds like it would be amazing. Do you have any sort of meditation routine that you do, or walking in nature or mindfulness routine, anything like that?
Yeah, walking for me is probably my main spiritual practice. I've never been good at sitting meditation. Just and then it hurts my body, and I sit enough already. Just I teach online and with writing and stuff. So walking for me, sauntering as Thoreau called it, which it's a holy, or can be a holy, contemplative activity that I think allows the mind to wander, in the sense that the mind, I think, is a fully embodied activity. It's not this separate essence that floats above the body. And so whether it's yoga, or for some people sitting meditation helps them achieve that sense of stillness. But for me, it's walking. It could be anywhere. It could be walking down a neighborhood street. It could be hiking on a nature trail, or it could be going to the beach, walking on the sand, listening to the waves crash. It activates and reattunes my mind to the rhythm of things. And whether that's just the rhythm of my own legs as I walk, or it's the rhythm of the waves if I'm at the ocean. Being able to attune to the environment and to feel like any static energy or stuckness in my thought patterns can sort of be massaged out just by virtue of the simple act of walking. So that's what does it for me. But as a philosopher, I think maybe for most people, reading isn't a spiritual practice, but the kind of texts that I read sort of engender a contemplative mood, require a contemplative mood to sort of ponder and deepen into what's being said. Philosophical writing is not straightforward, right? So you read a sentence in one of the great philosophical texts of history, and it doesn't make any sense the first time you read it, but there's something to it. And so the struggle to understand can be a mind expanding exercise, right? And so I would invite people to approach reading, which may seem more like a chore. It depends what you're reading, of course, but when you're reading philosophy, when you're reading a spiritual text, I think that too can become a spiritually enriching activity.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And I love the way you describe walking, and even just getting familiar with the motion or fluid movement of your legs moving. Like, it's the simplest thing, anyone can do it. Now, I initially came across your discussion on Psychedelics Today podcast. So my next question would be, have you had any psychedelic experiences, or do you dabble in the use of any psychedelics at all? I mean, I personally do, but I'm always curious for anyone else that does.
Yeah, they've been some of the more important life-changing experiences that I've had. I think psychedelics probably, I'll say they deeply enriched my appreciation for these basic philosophical questions and put me in touch with a form of experiential understanding that far surpasses what I can logically or rationally comprehend or explain, and basically taught me that as much as I value the intellect and the ability to articulate and explain and describe with precision the way the world works, I've been profoundly humbled by these experiences that, when you come back from them, when you come down, when you're done with the trip, you just laugh at yourself in the attempt to describe what happened,
Mm-hmm.
what you saw, what you felt, what you experienced. It's so far beyond language, and yet you also, I mean, a lot of those experienced with psychedelics would probably agree with me. I mean, I've found widespread agreement that the feeling of being compelled to describe it is intense, and I think some very beautiful accounts are available, and it's not that we should resist the desire to try to describe it, but I think what I've learned is just that it's, unless you're talking to someone else who has had such an experience, the descriptions you offer are just totally inadequate.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think psychedelics for our time in the context of modern culture and society can have a very important spiritual role. I don't think in and of themselves that they necessarily catalyze either individual or social transformation, but they can. So much with psychedelics has to do with set and setting, right? What are your intentions going in? What sort of container have you created? What is your worldview? What sort of values do you hold? What are your deeper metaphysical beliefs and inclinations? All of that goes into shaping the experience, such that even with the same, plant or chemical or fungal substance, two different people in different situations with different backgrounds can have totally different experiences, right? So it's not just about the molecules that we're talking about. It's the whole context within which they're ingested and within which that experience occurs.
Mm-hmm. Just because I know a lot of listeners of this podcast are interested and have tried psychedelics, would you mind even just describing one of the sort of transformative experiences that you would have had, and when that was? Like, have you tried them recently, or is it something that you dabble with every now and then?
Yeah, I would say I'm, not a frequent journeyer. I can describe my first psychedelic experience with psilocybin mushrooms when I was 19 years old. I was an undergraduate, just beginning to study philosophy at my university, and I had been reading a lot of Terence McKenna, and became really fascinated by the history of when psilocybin and LSD first burst onto the scene in the 60s, I mean the late 50s and 60s, and the Harvard psilocybin project with Tim Leary and Richard Alpert, and so with all of that understanding, I hadn't yet tried mushrooms until this experience, and I just took what McKenna called a heroic dose, alone in my college dorm room. And so it's important to provide a little bit more context. I was at this point very identified with more of the Asian spiritual traditions, Buddhism, Taoism, Zen, reading a lot of like D.T. Suzuki and Alan Watts, and a lot of the beat poets who were influenced by Eastern mysticism and so on. And I had really rejected the traditions of my Christianity and Judaism. I have a Jewish father and a Lutheran mother, and so I had rejected the biblical traditions and was really had turned east for my own spiritual path. But then, the first time I ate mushrooms, I had an experience which I could only describe as an encounter with what's sometimes called the Logos or Christ. Again, totally unexpected. And it kind of opened me to the esoteric and mystical traditions in the West, and that there's a different, deeper stream or lineage that's, closer to, my own cultural background. And so it allowed me to rediscover that. And it's hard to describe exactly what the experience was, but basically I was communing with this being, and it was very much a articulate. I know I was saying before that it's so hard to describe these experiences, but this first mushroom experience, is sometimes psilocybin can really activate your language abilities and capacities and playfulness with words. And indeed, that's what happened in this case. And so, it was just me alone with my journal, engaging in this conversation with, again, a being that I could only describe as a kind of Christ being, or the Christ archetype, let's say, and just engaged in a dialogue with this being for an hour or two about the nature of self and what it really means to love oneself, others, and the world. And this very, very religious experience, actually, I would say, and sort of set me on a new path. Not that I became a Christian or something, but definitely made me open again to the possibilities of, again, the sort of Western esoteric traditions and interpretations of Christianity and Judaism and so on. And I still, highly value the Buddhist and Hindu and the Vedic traditions, but it's I think made me a more whole person, in the sense that I can draw appreciatively from the whole panoply of religious lineages that are out there.
Yeah, that's pretty big. That was your first time? That's crazy. Yeah, that's a pretty big dose. But it is really great that you journaled that process. I mean, and did you still have that conversation? Wow, that's great. Have you ever gone back and read through it?
Yes. It does help me, you know, it does transport me back to the experience, kind of like a little bit of a flashback experience, but also, maybe others would have this experience too, when you're tripping and you describe the experience in a way that seems so profound at the time, and you come back later and it's like, oh, yeah, okay. But the one of the aspects of the experience was I had a poster in my room at the time of the Om symbol, and I started, I have like 15 pages of me drawing that symbol over and over again, and it was like morphing into a sun, and then an eye, and then the meaning of this seed syllable like became so potent and morphing into these different pictures that again, at the time while tripping, it was blowing my mind, but afterwards it's like the way that symbols shape our consciousness is so mysterious, because it can, if you're not in the right state of mind, seem like just a bunch of scribbles on the page, just a bunch of nonsense. But, so someone else who didn't have the experience I was having while exploring and drawing this symbol in various ways, they would look at it and, it doesn't mean anything. But for me, it does. It's like the footprints of a very transformative path of thought and experience that I was going through at the time. And so, yeah, it's nice to have that
Mhm.
record, though it's very personal, right? So I wouldn't expect anyone else to read this and be like, wow.
Yeah, yeah. No, it is. I've journaled a few times, but sometimes it is exactly what you're describing. In that moment, it's so profound, and then you look back at it later, you're like, well, okay, yeah, like, okay,
Yeah.
it's all right. Um, yeah, I've actually when I do the sensory deprivation sessions, I use psilocybin mushrooms, and usually I'm doing anywhere between like a 2 gram to like 4 gram. I don't go much higher than that. Um, Obviously can't journal in there, but the experiences are pretty profound. And I don't bother really trying to describe them to people for the reason that you've mentioned. It's almost I usually just summarize it like I left my body. Let's just put it that way. I checked in on my body. It was good. It was in the tank, and I just left again. Like there's been a few of those.
Yeah.
It is tricky to describe. Have you had any experiences with like DMT or ayahuasca or anything like that?
Yes. Um, yeah. So with, DMT, it's so powerful and intense and so short that it's, it has its unique character. And, what I can share about that is one experience where I smoked the DMT twice in the span of about 20 or 30 minutes. And what was so striking to me the second time, as I think I got maybe 2 hits in, and as I started to blast off, my first thought was, I can't believe how quickly I forgot how intense this is. And so there's so much in the experience that we can't even recall. It reminds me of like Dante in the Divine Comedy when he's approaching the Godhead. He says something like, memory failed to follow me into this realm,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
So, but it's there's definitely a sense of leaving one's body, entering into higher dimensions where it's not just that you see geometrical forms and pretty patterns. It's like, no, as many people report, there are sentient beings there. And I admit I had read a bit about other people's experiences, and so maybe I was primed in some sense, but there's the distinct feeling of arriving in a dimension with these other beings who were doing important work of some kind, and they're surprised to see me. Like, how did he get here? They're not. I didn't feel any ire or anger or anything like that. Just the sense of you're not supposed to be here. And so I, sometimes worry that this is almost like gate crashing in the sense that we're using substances to catapult ourselves into realms where maybe it might be more ideal to have some preparation for or understanding of where we're going and what we might be witnessing, rather than just sort of crashing the party.
Yeah, yeah.
So, you know, I do worry about that, but I also think I don't want to discourage curiosity and exploration, but just given the sense that so many people have that the universe is populated by intelligence of various kinds at various levels, and that DMT and maybe, yeah, 5-MeO DMT and even salvia to some degree, though, these really potent substances, that they're catapulting us so quickly into these other dimensions that we don't know what sort of activity we're disturbing by showing up in these places.
Mhm.
and I'm just wildly speculating here, but I these are sort of the impressions I'm left with these very
Yeah,
bizarre
yeah.
experiences.
I wonder if that's why it's good to have shamans and guides in a lot of those cases, because they will sort of prime and prep and even help guide and through the music and things like
Hmm.
that.
Yeah.
They can definitely help someone that just, pops up in another dimension, like, whoa, what's going on? And then the other entities are like, who are you?
Yeah.
Like it definitely would, I'm sure, help. It is quite intense. I've tried the 5-MeO, and it is a blasting off. That's the way to put it. I didn't do it twice. I just did it the once, and it was pretty crazy. I actually experienced like I went to like it was like uh, almost like a circus in a way. That's the way I would kind of describe it. Is very like sensory overload. I even saw those like kind of gesture characters that some people describe. Um, that was just like one level, and then I got past that level, and I can't even really describe after that. It was totally insane. Um,
Hmm.
but for you to go back a second time, and I could. A friend of mine that was with me at the time, he went back and did the second time too, and I was just thinking, you know what, that was pretty intense the first time. So yeah, going back a second, it would probably be equally as intense. Um, do you think that this is something that I guess is becoming more? You mentioned that people sort of are getting aware of the fact that there's other beings, other entities, and things like that in our universe or in sort of a multiverse type model. Do you feel that that's becoming more popular like, among mainstream society, that people are getting? Because I find a lot of people are still like caught up on this like UFO, like alien, like grays type of thing. Um, do you think people are thinking a little bit more deeply than that, or more so?
I mean, I've certainly had conversations about this with many people for whom the idea that what the popular culture construes as sort of fleshy, embodied aliens, whether the Greys or whoever, arriving in
Hmm.
metal spaceships from some other planet, that might actually be a kind of reified image of what might be something more like interdimensional beings that don't need to travel through space in metal spaceships. But I have no idea. This is very deep territory, but I do know that there's a long history of speculation and contemplation about what we nowadays would call interdimensional beings in terms of angelic hierarchies, the Sephiroth in Kabbalah and the emanations in Neoplatonism, and the way that our level of existence, the physical world, is just one layer of a much more richly textured reality. And I think as much as I value science and physics and biology, the kind of knowledge we can develop as human beings using our normal senses and our rational minds is profoundly limited. And we should, remain open to the sources of insight that can come through, imagination and intuition, which this psychedelic experience, I think, forces us to rely more upon, because the rational mind just all it can do is whimper and mutter in the face of these sorts of experiences. And it's, I think, for the most part, the dominant culture nowadays, particularly intellectuals and academics, are not, I don't think, ready to accept that there are intelligences pervading the universe that are greater than the human intellect. We like to think of ourselves as the smartest organism, at least on this planet, and it might take a bit more time. With, I think psychedelics are clearly starting to come back into the discussion, not just in the popular culture, but in academia. There's a lot of research going on expanding beyond just the mental health applications into, there's, I have a chapter in a book, Philosophy and Psychedelics. So philosophers are taking psychedelics seriously as a research tool.
Hmm.
you know,
That's the way I see them, to be honest. It is a research tool, and I see them as tools or technologies. And yeah, no, that makes total sense.
yeah. Though I should just caution, treating them as tools makes it seem like we are the kind of the master engineer that knows exactly what we're doing, and
As soon as you
is
take it, you'll find out that's not the case.
yeah, right.
Yeah, yeah. Well, when it comes to, that's why I like mushrooms in particular, because I find that it for me in particular, taps me into this ancient like a wisdom that's been part of Earth for way longer than we have, and it totally like it synergizes nicely with humans, and I find I have great experiences, but I just find that I'm very respectful of this like ancient wisdom that comes with the mushroom, and I haven't really tried LSD and things like that. But I think it's because I'm so comfortable with that mushroom and that wisdom that it's like when I take it, it's just so familiar to me, and it kind of helps me with the sense of forgetfulness that I have when I just go about the world like day to day. I just feel like, yeah, did you have a similar experience when you tried psilocybin? That it was, I mean, you mentioned that this sort of Christ-like archetype, and I have had that as well on the substance. But do you find that there's some wisdom there that it's been a part of the human experience for a while? But what are your thoughts on it?
I do experience that distinctly with psilocybin mushrooms in comparison to, say, LSD, which it's a much younger molecule. I mean, you could argue that the ergot fungus and the alkaloids derived from that were part of ancient mystery rites. I mean, there's speculation about that, but LSD 25 synthesized in the lab in 1938 for the first time, right? It's doesn't have as much of a morphic field, let's say, historically
Mm,
built up around it, whereas psilocybin mushrooms have been used for perhaps 10,000, I mean, even millions of years potentially
mhm,
with our hominid ancestors, with especially richly developed traditions of use in Central and South America. Though, again, there's evidence for the use of psilocybin on multiple continents. And so I think, yeah, we're tapping into this rich history when we use these, when we eat these mushrooms. And I tend to feel more like there's a teacher in the mushrooms that has, yeah, a lesson for me. I'm not as much in the driver's seat of the experience, and it tends to be more nowadays a kind of profound grief arises that's difficult. It's not like, an enjoyable experience, but it's deep and enriching and grounding, and coming out of the experience on the other side, I just feel renewed, and as opposed to, say, LSD, where the experience can feel more like, again, not totally, but more like I'm, or at least some self, maybe not my ego, but that my higher self is kind of more in the driver's seat, and that my intentions are shaping it, and that it's less clothed by a history, and that there's less of a lesson coming at me, and more of my own will and intention and exploration that's kind of driving the experience, right?
mm, mm.
Mushrooms come with a sort of message or a teaching like already there, is kind of how I would distinguish the phenomenology of it, the experiential aspect of it. But I don't know
Mm.
how widespread that is.
Yeah, and would you recommend for someone that hasn't really tried any psychedelics, like for me, I would always lean more towards the psilocybin. But what is your personal recommendation for anyone that's just come to you? They're interested in philosophy, they're interested in deeper understanding of things, and they've never tried any psychedelics, but they do have that interest as well.
I tend not to um, recommend that people do psychedelics. I think it's something you as an individual either feel called to or not. If you do feel called to it, I mean, there's always risks, right? Most of those risks can be mitigated again by paying attention to set and setting.
Hmm.
Make sure you're in the right state of mind. There are interactions with different pharmaceuticals you need to be aware of, but also make sure you're in a safe environment. I don't think you always need a sitter. I personally prefer to just be at home, in the evening and with I know a container that's going to be quiet. I won't be disturbed and so on. But I don't think psychedelics are for everyone, and I don't think anyone should feel pressured like, oh, if I don't have this experience, I'm missing out, and there's no
I'm
other
more
way.
thinking like someone that specifically has that interest and then they
Mm.
are seeking out that advice because there is this stigma around it where people don't feel they can openly discuss it.
Hmm.
So that's why I like to openly discuss it.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
obviously prefaced with what we've discussed earlier in the set and
Mhm.
setting, and having a sort of even having a guide or a shaman is great. But
Mhm.
someone that has considered all that and now they're like want to take the leap.
Yeah.
That's sort of what I was thinking.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think just going into it with reverence and in general, I think I feel very strongly that the proper psychedelics, mushrooms, LSD, DMT, that this is a cognitive freedom issue ultimately, and that the fact that they're Schedule One substances is just absurd. People should have the freedom, adults, to explore their consciousness without the state trying to interfere and
Oh
sort
yeah,
of
I mean,
arresting
look
them.
at cannabis even in Canada. I mean, I'm in Canada, so
Yeah,
for years leading up to the legalization, it was just a joke. Like technically it was illegal, but no, everyone ignored it. Like
right.
the cops ignored it, like everyone ignored it because
Hmm.
it was on track to becoming legalized, in which case now it's totally legal. And I see mushrooms going in that same direction. So
Yeah.
the fact that they've had Schedule One classification is kind of a joke, really, in a lot of ways. I mean, it's wild.
I mean, at least if you look at the history in the United States, the reasons for that, the status given to these substances is political and
Mhm.
often racist. I mean, with cannabis, certainly, I think the
Oh yeah,
Kentucky
yep.
laws, but that's beginning to change, not quickly enough, but it is beginning to change. And so that there's the cognitive liberty aspect of it, but at the same time, while I think adults should have the right to explore consciousness and including altering their consciousness, I think it's important to bring a sense of reverence to the experience
Mhm.
and to be prepared to be knocked on your ass, like to have your assumptions about who you are kind of ripped away from you, and to realize that even the so-called bad trips are potentially healing, profoundly healing. And the reason they're bad is because it can be really painful to have false identities stripped away and to really be forced to face yourself. I mean, you can relive memories, events, ways that you've treated people, familial dynamics, relationship to parents and siblings and stuff can come up, and the state of the world can all rush into your consciousness and be quite overwhelming. And yeah, feelings of grief, like I was describing, can really
Yeah,
dominate your
I love that
experience.
you mentioned the grief because I have experienced that, and especially if I get that's the world sort of feeling, even in the tank, when I have left my body and I've been sort of in this earth realm sphere, whatever you want to call it, I have felt that, and honestly, I've like completely dipped from there. I was like, all right, peace out. And I just kept going because it is so overwhelming. And I've talked with a lot of spiritual teachers that really emphasize on not for someone not to immerse themselves into that, because that's just sort of this one experience that's sort of manifest over, many, many years on earth, when it comes to war and famine and all these problems that we have and these separations that people create amongst themselves. It can be very overwhelming in terms of a psychedelic experience. I mean, that's from my take on it anyways. How do you feel that sense of grief or sadness when entering in that space?
Well, I mean, it can tear you open and turn you inside out, and if you're able to hold the confrontation with, I mean, there's a German word for this, Weltschmerz, which is sort of like world weariness in translation. It's like just feeling the weight of history and the suffering of the world and the seeming hopelessness of finding a way to heal from this history. It can feel like you're drowning in it, but inevitably in the course of a journey, whether through your own intention or through just the rhythm and the process itself, you come out the other side of that. And there's always another side. There's always a light that balances the dark. And often the periods of grief in a journey will subside and open up into gratitude. And you see the other side of life and history and all the ways that human beings cooperate and through association and collaboration are able to bring about such tremendously exciting and amazing things and accomplishments. And so there's always another side to it. And so it's, important to recognize and bring about that balance again, either through your own intention or just in trusting the process. I would say don't resist these darker emotions that can come up in the journey. That can make it much worse. Go with it and just trust that you will come out the other side. And you can feel like you're losing your mind and like you're going crazy when especially if you resist. And I've heard many people describe how like they had this point during a journey where they thought they might just be like this forever, like they broke themselves or something. It's not true. You will move through that and you will be whole again. The shamanic dismemberment is a process you go through and you will reassemble on the other side. And so it's just really important to trust the process and allow the full spectrum of human experience to unfold. So yeah, I mean that's about as much advice as
No,
I
it's
could
great
offer. Yeah.
advice. Great advice. Do you feel that's why that Christ archetype is so powerful in helping with that transmutational process where you're moving towards gratitude, moving towards love and joy and these things?
I mean, totally. I mean, for me, one of the meanings of that archetype is that despite death and suffering, love persists. And that if you can face death with love, your own death, the death of others, and just hold fast to this transpersonal form of love, unconditional love, that that death can be, if not overcome in the literal sense that you're immortal, but rather death can be perceived as a doorway into rebirth, and that in that rebirth, the new form of identity that one can step into is not immune to suffering, but takes a different attitude to it and sees it as, again, like part of this balance of light and dark in the universe that drives the whole creative process. And so, yeah, I mean, reconciling suffering and death with the fact that life in its human form, but in any form, has continued for billions of years on this planet, I think it's an important experiential insight. You can intellectually reflect upon it forever, but you have to really experience, like, why has life persisted despite death and suffering and pain, and even life has complexified for billions of years such that it's more sensitive and so capable of even greater suffering. Like, I think a human being can suffer way more than a jellyfish.
Mm-hmm.
Why would life have pursued greater sensitivity, if it was all just this one-sided pain and suffering and death? And so, I think psychedelics can provide us with an experiential insight into the cycle of life and death and rebirth, and to just love the process, despite what it may appear to be if we only take a one-sided perspective on it.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you come at this from a perspective of someone that's engaged in philosophy as well, because it does give a very unique angle to it. Because a lot of the psychedelic journey you're describing is almost like the philosophical journey as well. I mean, they seem like intertwined. Um, yeah, it's great that that you've had that experience, like, from a young age, and that you carried it with you. It's really great. Um, I don't want to take too much more of your time. I want to be a bit mindful of your time, but did you have any sort of closing thoughts for anyone listening to this, on anything we've discussed? I mean, a little bit of it was kind of doom and gloom, but we came out of it lovely, I would say. Um, yeah, and any closing thoughts for anyone listening?
Um, I would say just seek out those who you can have these types of conversations with, and challenge yourself to, you know, look beyond the edges of consensus reality. I think we live in a culture that is predominantly driven by fear and kind of narcissistic selfishness, and we all succumb to this to varying degrees, because we're all shaped by this culture. But for me, philosophy and the spiritual path is about not being afraid to look beyond the what's considered to be normal and acceptable in our dominant culture, and to find the others who are willing to go there with you, because it's really hard to do it alone. And so that's why I enjoy conversations like this, just to be able to reflect with one another and share experience and compare notes, and continue to go deeper. And if enough of us can engage in this way, then that dominant culture can be transformed and healed and deepened. And that's what I live for as an educator. That's my purpose and calling in life. But you don't have to be a teacher. You don't have to be a philosopher, at least in the sense of a professional. We can all be philosophers just by virtue of being human and questioning the nature of our existence. But I think the human condition is such that we're supposed to be examining, we're supposed to be questioning, we're supposed to be wondering. And if we don't make space to do that, if we don't cultivate relationships with others who can help us in dialogue explore that wonder, then I don't think we're living to the full capacity of our humanness, of our humanity. So.
Mm-hmm. That's very well said, and thank you for having this conversation with me, because it's refreshing when I get to have these, because my day-to-day does not include this type of stuff. I mean, business and technology, as I said, is not. Yeah, we're looking at, like, mobile apps and marketing campaigns and statistics and analytics and blah, blah, blah. So it is very great to have these conversations, and they are few and far between, I find. But when we do get them out there, when we do share them, the feedback is immense. People reach out and they say thank you. So on that note, do you have any socials people can reach you at? All of your information will be in the episode description, but if you want to just mention it, if people want to shoot you a message or a comment or anything.
Yeah, I've been on YouTube for a long time. Footnotes to Plato is my YouTube channel. Do a lot of philosophy dialogues. I'm doing a reading group right now that's recorded if people want to check that out. And then my blog is the same thing, footnotes numeral to plato.com. So yeah,
That's a
come
great
find me.
username, by the way. That's really good. Yeah,
Thanks.
it caught my eye when I saw it. I was like, that's really nice. All right. Well, thank you again, and
Yeah, my
have a great
pleasure,
day.
Adam. Thanks for having me.